Violence and terror in the Russian Revolution. The word revolution creates an image of sudden and forceful change, suggesting that a society is torn from one path of development into another. The sheer scale of the death and destruction associated with the Russian Revolution is almost unparalleled in modern history. Millions were killed by war, terror, hunger, and disease within a very short space of time. Violence before the Russian Revolution. Violence was widespread in Russia before the First World War, but historians believe the war intensified this pre-existing violence. The 1905 revolution, wars with other countries, and worker strikes were one element of the violence, but the state itself was responsible for violence too. For example, the state's pogrom riots killed thousands of Russian Jews and forced millions more to flee. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, revolutionaries began taking action by assassinating thousands of Russian state leaders, including Tsar Alexander II himself in 1881. An iconic moment of government violence called Bloody Sunday occurred on January 22, 1905. Government forces fired upon a demonstration which had been protesting peacefully for political and social rights. The government initially responded to this 1905 revolution by making legal changes, but it later resorted to military force. The empire dissolves. Why did the revolution descend into violence? After the 1917 revolutions, various organizations attempted to take control of Russia. The first revolution, called the February Revolution, overthrew the government and left about 1,400 people dead. A new provisional government was set up with the goal of creating a more humane society. The provisional government quickly abolished the death penalty and granted Russian citizens important new civil rights. Still, the provisional government struggled to deal with the violence that occurred after the fall of the Tsar. The armed forces began to rebel against military leaders, and peasants began violently taking lands from their landlords. On top of all of this, Russia was struggling in World War I. Many peasant soldiers wanted to return to their villages instead of fighting in the war. They feared that they would lose out if they stayed on the front lines while land was being redistributed back home. As the provisional government lost its grip on the country, it resorted to violence in an attempt to regain control. During the second 1917 revolution, called the October Revolution, a political group called the Bolsheviks seized the opportunity to take power. Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, wanted to turn World War I into a European-wide class war. Lenin believed that the interests of the working class and the wealthy were opposed to each other, and that the classes would eventually engage in a violent struggle. Lenin wanted a civil war between the working class and the wealthy, with the goal of creating a state dominated by the working class. The Bolsheviks believed in a dictatorship would be necessary to win the class war. A dictatorship is a type of government where one person or political party takes complete control of the state, and the rights of the people are often limited or taken away. After the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks were able to begin building their dictatorship. How did civil conflict intensify in Russia? Violence increased after the Bolsheviks took power, as opposing political groups became engaged in a bloody civil war. The Bolsheviks wanted to protect their new government from counter-revolutions by opposing political groups. Inspired by the French Revolution of 1789, they created a system to secure their dictatorship against the threat of counter-revolution, internal crisis, and invasion. In January 1918, the Bolsheviks established the Red Army, which was responsible for defending the Bolshevik state. In addition, the notorious Cheka was founded at the end of 1917. It was a small, violent security force responsible for combating opposition to the Bolsheviks, and it came to be greatly feared over the course of 1918. At the same time, a lack of food was driving further conflict. In the countryside, the Bolsheviks struggled to establish a dictatorship over the food that was produced by peasant farmers. This made it more difficult for the Bolsheviks to help ease the hunger that was plaguing the cities, and it created an atmosphere of social war of the cities against the countryside. The state began forcibly taking extra grain from the peasants, often by using horrible violence. Conflict, conflict increased as the people continued to oppose the new Bolshevik policies. The Red Army was in violent conflict with the White Army, Green Army, and other groups who opposed the Bolsheviks. Meanwhile, class conflict was worsened by local factors such as food scarcity, rivalry between ethnicities, nations and regions, and crime. How did the violence of the Russian Civil War shape the Soviet state? The Soviet state was developed by the Bolsheviks and strengthened in the early 1920s. It was clearly shaped by the harsh experiences of the First World War and the Civil War. Throughout the Civil War, the Bolshevik state claimed to be the only group with the right to use violence. Through violence, they attempted to create order out of the economic problems, food shortages, and political tension they faced. Resistance to the state was harshly punished, and peasant revolts against the Bolsheviks, such as the Tambov Rebellion, were ruthlessly dealt with. Concentration camps and poison gas led to hundreds of thousands of peasants being killed. Under pressure from these uprisings, the Bolshevik leaders soon moved away from their original harsh policies. Still, the Bolsheviks didn't go so far as giving up their dictatorship or the system of repression they had developed. The Civil War period produced the state system that was later used by Joseph Stalin. Stalin was a Bolshevik leader who eventually took control of the Soviet state through campaigns of brutality that killed millions of people. He was striving to rapidly create a modern industrial nation out of an underdeveloped agricultural society.